I think the biggest misconception is that the problem is with the technology. In fact, the problem isn't with the tech, it's with the data and the way in which we use that data, and we feed it into the tech to produce the outcomes which are questionable, problematic, difficult, risky, dangerous, whatever it might be. I think the most important question is simply that AI ethics as a single regulator isn't working. If you look at the recent disclosures about problems with the major social media platforms, which all have very detailed ethical principles and guidelines that they say they work by, in fact, there's evidence that shows there are massive abuses in relation to the protection of personal data. If that's the case, we're going to have to start interrogating what's not working with ethics and suggest ways in which we can add to Ethics Plus that makes it a more useful and a more effective and a more actionable regulator. Look, I think we're awash with ethical frameworks and standards. I've been talking to standardizers recently saying that we really are not without some very refined and sophisticated standards for technical efficacy. What we don't have is the assurance that these are working across the AI ecosystem, that in fact, all the people involved in the production and the deployment of AI, are they in situations where they can effectively understand and then propagate ethics? And just on that point, there are many externalities like pressures from the market, pressures from clients, which often make it impossible for young professionals to effectively abide by ethics above these other market frames. I think the role of scholars is to put a critical light on any regulatory framework. Up until recently, there's just been too much, nice affection given to ethics without a serious reflection on whether ethics alone is the right direction for us to be heading in. And so I think that interdisciplinary work from researchers and scholars can make ethics that normative backbone in the regulatory frame, but it's also got to talk about ways in which we can get more out of regulation than simply talking about ethics on its own. Well, that's an interesting point, because I don't think that consortia like the one you referred to really should be in the business of promoting a particular regulatory framework. I think what we should do is to think about this more globally. See, so much of the discussion about ethics comes out of the North, the West, the developed world, where in the rest of the world, the South world where I work in, there really isn't much discussion about the Asian voice or other voices coming from other parts of the world about what their ethical preferences might be. Now, I believe in universal standards, but I also believe in the fact that we have to be sensitive to the cultural realities in different parts of the world. So a global grouping like this can bring out those additional voices, and I think that's necessary. Again, I think to some extent the pandemic is just the start of a surveillance society that we're going to have to be very carefully watching. As the pandemic moves into a sort of normal frame, the issue for those of us who are concerned about pervasive surveillance is how will these surveillance technologies keep going? Now, certainly from an Asian point of view, there's no sign whatsoever that many of these surveillance technologies, tracing and tracking and safe entry tech is going to disappear. And in some places like China, in fact, it's just growing and growing at an exponential pace. So I think what we need to do is to move away from the emergency thinking of the pandemic and start reflecting seriously on, do we want to live in a surveillance society or not? And where does regulatory frameworks come into play to control that eventuality?